Welcome back to Peace Puzzles Season 2, Preparing to Negotiate Peace. I'm Katie from PILPG, and in this season, we're diving into the critical steps that you should take before stepping into peace negotiations. In today's episode, my colleague Nicole Carl, counsel with PILPG, will be joined by founder and president Dr. Paul R. Williams to discuss building internal consensus within a negotiation delegation. Now, throughout this season, you'll be hearing from both me and my colleagues as we guide you through different aspects of negotiation preparation. Whether you're preparing for high stakes talks or you're simply curious about the behind the scenes processes of peace negotiations, this season is packed with the tools and knowledge that you need to approach negotiations with clarity and confidence. Let's hand over to Paul and Nicole.
Paul, you often describe negotiations as akin to three-dimensional chess. To kick us off, why is that?
I use that metaphor, Nicole, because most people think of negotiations as bilateral, one party against another party. And maybe some folks might stretch it and think, well, okay, there's the one party and another party, and then there's the mediators. And you have to be negotiating with the mediators in order to win them over to your side or your perspective, as well as the other party. But the reality is, it is three-dimensional. Not only are you negotiating with the other party, the mediators, but there is a constant ongoing negotiation within the delegation itself. And I was surprised by this. The very first time I served on a delegation to a peace negotiation, every evening, the delegation that I was serving as the legal advisor for would meet and have 2 or 3 hours of intensive internal negotiations, which were just as vibrant, lively, and contentious as the negotiations throughout the day with the opposing party. I thought, okay, well, this was just this delegation. Every single delegation that I've served as a legal advisor, including a couple of U.S. delegations, just as contentious within the delegation itself as it is vis-a-vis opposing parties. Different issues, but the same level of intensity.
Interesting metaphor. And so, if building this internal consensus was such a cakewalk, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Why is it such a challenge to build internal consensus within one's delegation?
If you have a truly representative delegation, it will be representative. You will have non-state armed actors. You will have political elite. You will have civil society. Ideally, you will have substantial women's representation of the youth, and marginalized population. Each of these individuals on the delegation represents a constituency that has legitimate needs and interests that have to be dealt with at the negotiation. And one thing that we could talk a little bit about it later in this conversation, but I want to put out there, what I find very surprising and somewhat disheartening is that these democratic delegations are often frowned upon by the mediators. I need to count on my hands and then take off my shoes and count on my toes how many times mediators have expressed disdain, frustration for the disorganized delegation that I've been representing or working as the legal advisor to. And then having to point out, well, the other delegation is a totalitarian regime, most of the times responsible for atrocity crimes. This delegation, well, of course there's internal dissension. Of course they're disorganized. And of course they have multiple perspectives because they're actually democratic and representative of the varied interests and constituencies of a particular country or a particular opposition group.
Okay, so we're on the Democratic side and we have these constituencies that you mentioned. What does it actually mean to build internal consensus among them?
Building internal consensus means coming to a genuine consensus, a genuine agreement among a delegation as to their views on self-determination, power sharing, security sector reform, finding a way to take these varied interests, and many of which are quite opposed to one another, and develop some commonality that the delegation can not only put on the table for the mediators or for the opposing party, but can also stay committed to, and that every member of the delegation can vigorously defend.
So hopefully we have some time before going into these negotiations. We have our group, we're ready to go. Why is it important before the negotiations to build this internal consensus? Like the group, delegation, or the party that you're with?
So if you're the authoritarian or the totalitarian delegation or the delegation responsible for atrocity crimes, and you're coming under pressure to be in a negotiation, or maybe you're under economic sanctions, the very first thing you're going to have on your to-do list is to sow dissension among the opposing delegation, to get some or all members of the opposing delegation to walk out of the negotiations. And then if you're the bad actor, you can say, well, we came to Geneva or Rambouillet or Dayton, and we tried in good faith, but we couldn't negotiate with the opposition delegation because they were so fractured. All the while, you're doing things as the bad actor to try to undermine that delegation. Some of the things that we've seen the bad actor delegations do, for instance, is to increase atrocity crimes. We were at a negotiation in Geneva, and the opposing country kicked off the week of negotiations by increasing the number of barrel bombs that they were dropping on civilians. Made it exceedingly difficult for certain segments of the opposition delegation to be in Geneva, staying in a 4-star, 5-star hotel, and go into negotiations. And the authoritarian regime did this on purpose in order to try to drive a wedge among this opposition delegation. And the mediators, as we mentioned briefly earlier, will oftentimes fall for it.
Interesting points, Paul. Moving forward, say we have our delegation, we're at the beginning stages of preparation. What are some of the basic building blocks of creating this consensus among ourselves?
The first thing that a delegation needs to do is make it very clear within the delegation and then to the mediators and the opposing party that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Because there's always a fear that if you represent a certain segment of a delegation, that you'll reach agreement on 4 or 5 things, and then your interest won't be included in those 4 or 5 because you're number 7, 8, 9. And then somehow that phase of the negotiation will be concluded, and there will be an interim agreement, or there'll be a public communique, and your interest will be left out. So the number one rule is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, meaning nothing is agreed until all of the interests of the constituents represented in this delegation are considered, put on the table, and negotiated. The second strategy is to define essentially what the goals of the delegation are. So when you come to a table and within the delegation in either the late evening meeting or the early morning meeting, and you say, what is everyone's positions? They'll put all of their positions on the table. As a chair of the delegation, you need to bring those positions and interests, and we can talk about that in a little bit, together and define them as goals so that you can, on the very first day at the opening presentation, the very first proposal that's put on the table, you can list off 10, 11, a dozen goals that encompass the multitude of positions and interests that the members of the delegation have brought to the table.
Thanks for laying that foundation, Paul. Now, what are your first 2 tips on where to start? You can break it down for me. That would be great.
The first thing you want to do, Nicole, is work with the delegation to define success for the purposes of the negotiation. Is success stopping the violence? Is it a ceasefire? Is it regime change? Is it regime change with a democratic government? Or is it regime change with democratic government with adequate power sharing and devolution of political, economic, and administrative power to the regions of the country? Oftentimes, parties will go in with their 3 or 4 interests, each member of the delegation with 3 or 4 interests. But trying to know what you're seeking in terms of success or victory is very important, because during every phase of the negotiation, you'll want to measure whether you're actually moving towards success. Are you achieving success? And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about a best alternative to a negotiated settlement, because defining success is important before you start talking about walking out. And now the second tip for success, so to speak, is to identify and map the core interests among the delegation members, to literally put on paper all of the interests of the delegation. There's a variety of reasons why this is important. If you write it down, then it's validated. And I found that as a lawyer to peace negotiations, oftentimes I'm the only one in the room with the laptop going clickety clack, clickety clack. And they'll look at me and they'll say, what are you doing? I'm capturing everyone's interests. I'm mapping the interest. I'm turning it into peace agreement language. And then the delegation decides whether they want to put it on the table or not. But if people see their positions and their interests in writing, it's been validated. They also can see how extensive and how complicated it is. We were doing another negotiation between two republics that were creating a union treaty, and the party that I was representing had 4 options in their draft agreement for power sharing. And when we previewed this to the prime minister, he said, you have 4 options down here. I assume one is the opposing party's option. One is our option. And who represents the 3rd and the 4th option? Because this is a bilateral negotiation. And the answer was actually, no, we didn't even put the other side's position in. All 4 of these options are your delegation. And he's like, even I know you can't go into a negotiation and put 4 options for your own position. So we mapped the 4, but then we had to bring them down to consensus on one of those positions.
We might have to have another conversation just about that representation, Paul. It sounds like it was quite interesting. But I know you have some more tips for me. What else?
Nicole, one of the things that delegations benefit from doing in order to build and maintain internal consensus is to identify their best alternative to a negotiated settlement and to reach consensus on that. Because oftentimes different members of an eclectic, a representative delegation will have very different best alternatives. So for instance, if you're a non-state armed actor, you may have determined that it's marginally in your interest to go into negotiations. But if we're in negotiations, they're going to start talking about demobilization, demilitarization, reintegration, basically disarmament. And so you'll be thinking, my best alternative is to take it back outside in the parking lot and duke it out with the other party. Your best alternative is to return to violence because you've been doing it for a number of years. You're giving it a pause to have a ceasefire and do these negotiations, but you can always go back to the shield. But if you have marginalized population, women, youth, civil society on your delegation, their best alternative to a negotiated settlement is not to go back to being stuck in the middle of a conflict between armed actors. And you'll find that there's times, unless you reach a consensus among your best alternative, you'll be in the first 5 or 6 days of a negotiation, you'll hit a road bump, and the guys with guns will say, okay, this is failing. We don't like this. We're going to head back out to the field and engage in conflict because that's our best alternative. And the civilians will be thinking, whoa, wait a second. We're just having an argument about distribution of natural resources. Let's not go back to conflict. So reaching a consensus before you go into negotiations as to what might trigger a walkout. Because once you walk out, you're automatically going to your best alternative to a negotiated resolution. And you better know what that is before you walk out. And then the second one, which I'll just mention briefly, is red lines. You want to know what your red lines are for the entire delegation. So that when you're making compromises, because nobody goes in and says, you know what, we'll give you 60%, we'll take 40%, we're good. Because the other side will say, actually, no, we'll take 90% and give you 10%. So you go in and you say, no, we want 100%, you get 0. And then you eventually work down to what your red line is. But compromises happen really quickly. They happen late at night. They happen when the parties are fatigued, and they happen when the parties are under intense pressure by the mediators. And if you're dropping from position to position to position, you actually have to know what your floor is before you go below your floor and then your delegation implodes. I was involved in one peace negotiation, and I had a meeting with the president and the foreign minister of the country. And they basically said, we're going to tell you what our red lines are. We want you to write down each red line on a separate piece of paper. And your job in these negotiations, among other things, is that as we approach the red line, you need to verbally signal to us with the specific phrases they wanted me to use that we were approaching the red line. And then you're to pass us this piece of paper again to remind us of the red line. They knew what the red lines were, but they had been in these negotiations before, and they realized it would be this fatigue, crucible where they'd be under a lot of pressure to make concessions and start trading concessions from different chapters of the peace agreement. And you didn't want to accidentally trade someone else's red line because you were getting what you needed in your particular chapter of interest, so to speak.
As you're sharing, I have all these questions about the points that you're making. And I want to start with something you said a little bit earlier on defining success. Can you expand what you mean by this term?
So defining success, Nicole, is reaching and protecting your interests, not just your positions. And so when you pull a team together, everybody on the delegation will tell you what their positions are. So I was representing one delegation, and at the very first meeting, the chairman of the delegation said, right, so what do we want out of this? And somebody raised their hand from the non-state armed actor and said, we want our Liberation Army to be turned into a regular army, separate and distinct from the National Army. Okay. The second one said, we want independence. We want this republic that we're representing to be an independent country. And the third one said, we want the president of the country to be held responsible for war crimes. And they wrote these down, and they went to the mediators and said, these are our three positions. And the mediator said, yeah, I'm not really sure that the other side's going to agree to these on day one. Why do you want these three things? What are your interests? And so we worked with the delegation, my colleague and I, another lawyer, to understand, why did you want your own army? One of the reasons was they didn't want the armed militia, which were highly focused and subject to command and control during the conflict, to then dissipate and become armed actors within the economic environment, basically engaging in narco trafficking or organized crime. And by flipping it into an army, you would keep control of the non-state armed actors. They obviously also wanted to be able to defend themselves against the armed actors of the government. You could meet those interests in a variety of ways. One, security guarantees from the international community, and then other ways of organizing these armed actors into units that weren't essentially freelancing. Same thing with independence. There's all kinds of options for external self-determination, earned sovereignty, phased independence, which would give the people the right to govern themselves without independence the day after a peace agreement. And same with accountability. There were reasons why: historical record, victim catharsis, truth, that they wanted the president of the country to stand trial for war crimes. Did not reach agreement at the peace agreement, but in subsequent years, that individual was actually indicted, captured, and tried for war crimes before a court in The Hague. But bottom line, identify the interests and then figure out what your positions are, as opposed to just laying out your positions.
I see. Thanks, Paul. Now, how does one ensure that the goals and strategies that this delegation would consider to be a success are in fact in line with these interests that you mentioned?
Nicole, it's very important for the delegation, especially an inclusive, diverse, eclectic delegation, to spend ample time giving every member of the delegation a chance to express the views of their constituents, what their fears are, what their needs are, what their interests are, and then obviously they'll have positions. Oftentimes, there's a rush to get to negotiations, and you'll literally have members of the international community send a plane to the individuals we somehow identified as part of the delegation, and they're meeting one another in this capacity for the first time on the plane that then takes them to Rambouillet or Geneva or Paris or other places for these negotiations. You need to find ample time for them to spend a week, 10 days together, mapping, as we discussed. But also, you need to find a way within the delegation to validate the interest. The guys with guns will have an assumption that they've been shedding blood in this conflict, and their interests, their positions are weighted higher. Yes, marginalized populations and the youth have some views, but unless they've been actually engaged in armed activity, their views should be considered, but are not as weighty. You'll also find that the political elite believe that their views, because they're the political elite, are the most well thought out, sophisticated, and also carry the greatest weight. It's really important if you're on one of these delegations, or if you're advising one of these delegations, to as much as possible create a level weighting of all of the interests. Because you oftentimes find that the non-state armed actors represent a constituency wholly composed of the non-state armed actors. The political elite represent themselves, and the political elite oftentimes, which have led to this problem. But the marginalized populations, the women, the youth, civil society, represent upwards of 90% of the population. So you want to consider that when you're weighing the positions that the delegation will be putting on the table.
You're using a few phrases here, and I want to make sure that we're clear. Can you expand on the differences between interests and positions? And why is this distinction, in fact, really important to consider?
Nicole, I'm glad you asked me that question, because 9 out of 10 delegations that I've worked with, when you ask them, right, so we're going to go into negotiations, we should prepare. Oh, we're good. We have our positions in place. It's, yeah, you do. But what are your interests that underlie those positions? And below that, what are your needs and fears? Because I can pretty much guarantee you, you're not going to get your positions. The final agreement will not reflect 100% the positions that you've already drafted and will be putting on the table. But if you're clever about the negotiations, you may actually get almost all of your interests represented in the agreement. And you darn well better make sure that all of your needs are met and all of your fears are accounted for in that final agreement. And so if you start with a position of we're going to be independent, and the other side says no, where do you go from there? Where if you start with an acknowledgement that, well, our interest is in protecting our own political identity, engaging in self-government, giving our children a chance to grow up in a free and democratic society. We realize that this entire state is not going to become democratic, but if we could just separate out our piece of it, we could build a democratic state. And the reason is because, we need, in order to protect our cultural identity or language or heritage, to govern. And we fear that our identity will be extinguished if we maintain part of this larger state. Therefore, our position is independence. And our interests and our needs and our fears could be accommodated by earned sovereignty, phased independence, some type of international engagement with elections and other governance institutions as we move towards independence. So knowing your interests gives you much more flexibility. So think about it as an iceberg. You see an iceberg coming and that's the position. But under the tip of the iceberg is a huge mass of interests, needs, fears, and concerns. And just like the Titanic, you need to be aware of what's under those positions in order to be effective and maintain consensus within your delegation.
Thanks for making that distinction, Paul. And the iceberg visualization really helps me, and I'm sure others as well. Moving on to something else that you mentioned earlier, and I know we wanted to get back to it, is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or a BATNA, some might call it. What is a BATNA, and how does it help to build consensus?
To pull a baton, as we mentioned briefly earlier, is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Do you have options? Do you have options of returning to civil disobedience? Do you have options of returning to conflict? If this agreement fails, you'll have another negotiation in 6 months. So we don't really need to be here. Or our best alternative to this negotiated agreement is to go back and continue to be victims of genocide, victims of atrocity crimes. This is our last best effort to stop. And so if our best alternative is to be on the losing end of a conflict, well, we're going to have to make some pretty serious. Or if you're winning the conflict, if the international community is on your side, if the opposing side is under harsh economic sanctions, if the president of the opposing country is indicted for war crimes, really, best alternative may be to continue the conflict until you've reclaimed all of your territory, until you've been able to extinguish the threat to your civilians. Knowing that makes your decision to walk out of the negotiations a rational decision as opposed to an emotional decision. Because I could pretty much guarantee 3 times a day, a core group of the delegation is going to want to throw up their hands and walk out of these negotiations because they're stressful, they're emotionally traumatic, you're not getting all of your positions met. You cannot do the emotional. You have to do the rational. You have to think, right, yeah, we really want to walk out of these negotiations because we're deeply annoyed by what the mediators are doing, what the opposing party is doing. But let's look it up again. What is our best alternative? What are we walking out the door to? And then, okay, yeah, maybe it makes sense to walk out. Or you think, no, we don't want to go there. We have to suck it up and push through on these negotiations, help to achieve our interests and protect our needs.
And now some negotiations can go on for days or weeks. And as you and I know, circumstances on the ground change very quickly. Can a party's BATNA change throughout the course of these talks?
Yes, most definitely. And we've been emphasizing here what a party can do to build internal consensus before they go into a negotiation. But a party is going to have to continue to reevaluate their positions, their BATNA, their red lines throughout the negotiations, because sometimes these negotiations are multi-year negotiations, facts on the ground, so to speak, change. And you want to be able to, again, 3-dimensional chess, while you're managing the mediators, negotiating with the party across the table, you're going to want to be continually refreshing your internal positions and BATNAs and red lines.
Staying with this phrase that you're also using now, red lines. Can you describe what that is as well?
Nicole, a red line is the base below which whatever you agree upon will not meet your needs, guard against your fears, or reflect your interests. And people oftentimes, members of delegations will oftentimes set their red lines quite high. They'll say, our position is we should get 100%, but our red line is 80%. It's very difficult for a delegation that's eclectic and inclusive to see how far that number can be pushed down. Could it be pushed down to 40% or 35%? And in particular, if you have other members around the table that don't represent your constituency. So you're an armed actor and you say, well, right, our position is we should have our own army. Our red line is that we'll have our own army. The government will have its own army. We'll have a joint command. And then civil society says, quite frankly, I think we should engage in DDR, demilitarization, demobilization, and reintegration. There's going to be immediate conflict within that delegation. And so you're going to need somebody in the delegation to say, okay, the delegation itself has different interests. The armed state actors have various interests, but the civilians are a little tired of conflict. They want to reduce the number of weapons in society and come down to a way that meets the interests of the civilians, which is not going to be complete zero, and also meets the interests of the non-state armed actors, which is not going to be 85%. Reaching agreement on that before you start arguing with the other side is crucial.
Thanks, Paul. And then sticking on this, how does one develop this red line?
Through a lot of late night negotiations among the members of the delegation. You need to have, and I know in a subsequent conversation, Nicole will talk about the different roles that actors play. You'll need to have an arbiter. One of the members of the delegation will have to play an exclusive role of a good faith arbiter. Oftentimes that individual comes from civil society. Even better if it's a former non-state armed actor who's transitioned to civil society. So somebody who literally comes without a constituency, without a package of interests, and simply says, my role is to constantly be facilitating, mediating the negotiation within the delegation so that we, the delegation, are primed to achieve success at the negotiating table with the party across the table. It's one of the most stressful and most difficult jobs within a delegation. But without it, an inclusive, diverse, eclectic delegation will disintegrate before your very eyes in a negotiation.
Clearly important. I understand the stress. And that's all we have time for today, Paul. But thank you so much for walking us through the steps to building this internal consensus among one's own delegation before they go talk to another party. Anything else you'd like to share with listeners as they go into their own negotiations?
No, Nicole, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me, and for those that are preparing for negotiations. Remember, it's three-dimensional chess. Not to be frustrated or surprised that you will spend as much time negotiating with the other members of your delegation as you do trying to manage the mediators, and as you do negotiating across the table. Acknowledging that before you go into a negotiation and setting up an infrastructure and systems to deal with it throughout the negotiation is an essential key to success.
Thank you again. It's always a pleasure.